Well, hello and welcome everyone. It's 3 o'clock and it's time to start our Tree School webinar. I'm Glenn Ahrens, your OSU Extension Forester for Clackamas, Marion, and Hood River counties, and I work with the Tree School team. It's my pleasure to be your host today for our webinar. Tree School Online is a production of OSU Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Program and the Partnership for Forestry Education. We want to give special recognition to the Oregon Forest Resources Institute for leading the project, and they also have a grant from the Forest Service, U.S. Forest Service, and Oregon Department of Forestry that gave them some extra funds to cover our expenses for Tree School Online. So we're really happy to be able to regroup after we had to cancel our physical tree school. I do have to say, I miss seeing people in person, but we're doing the best we can, and I hope you find this educational. The Tree School Online webinars are scheduled every Tuesday from now until July 28th. There's 2 webinars each Tuesday, one at 10 a.m. and another at 3 p.m. I have some housekeeping details to cover before we get started. We're on Zoom, and the Zoom toolbar should be located at the bottom of your screen, and you should have some controls down there. If you don't see it, you can scroll your cursor over this area and it should pop up. On some hardware such as iPads and other computer hardware, the Zoom toolbar is going to be on top of your display. Many of the features are going to be accessed from the toolbar, and especially important for us when it comes to the question and answer and the polls that I'll tell you about. Your audio as participants is muted unless we unmute you. In general, we're not going to do that. The video is not available for attendees, participants. We really want you to ask your questions, written questions, in the Q&A box. And as they come to you, put them in the box and we'll be watching those and answering them particularly at the end, and there's also a break in the middle for us to answer your questions. So please put those in the Q&A box. The chat we're going to use if you're having problems, so that's being monitored as well. And if you have issues, you can put them in chat and we'll address them. Please don't put your questions in the chat. You can also use that to send messages to panelists or to other participants. We're also posting the resources for each of our webinars, and also the webinar recordings when we're done will be posted at Tree School Online on the knowyourforest.org page. And then you can go back and click on the webinar descriptions and see where the resources are. There'll be handouts or links, some things that we covered during the webinar. Also, for this session and many of the other webinars, we're offering continuing education credits for the Oregon Professional Logger Program under Associated Oregon Loggers, and you'll find a way to sign up there under the resources on the Tree School Online site to let us know that you attended and want that credit. As I said, these are being recorded and they can be retrieved later, and tell your friends and neighbors to go watch this webinar after the fact. Another thing we're going to do here, we are going to have polls during this session, and particularly we want to kind of see who's out there and get to know you a little bit, and so our presenters know kind of where you're coming from. So I'll start one of those shortly after we begin the presentation. There will be one at the beginning and also one at the end. The polls should pop up on your screen in a box. You should see it pop up automatically when I start the poll, and after you answer the questions, the poll will just close out. If you don't see it, check the toolbar to see if there's a button that lights up for polls, and push the button and that should pop up the poll. So with that, I'm ready to introduce our speakers. So it's my pleasure to have Mike and Joe. If you guys would turn your microphones on anyway. Joe does not have video. He's holed up in the Department of Forestry office. So Mike Cloughesy is our speaker on forest protection laws. He's also a fearless leader for the partnership to help us put these webinars on. So thank you very much, Mike, and thanks for presenting. And I've known Mike for many years. I started in the old days, was an extension forester like myself, and then I graduated to be our forester for Oregon Forest Resources Institute. And then Joe Goldsby is a stewardship forester, someone who I've gotten to know and had the pleasure to work with here in Clackamas County, helping with stewardship forestry as well as with the forest protection laws. And so he's going to help Mike with this presentation. So go ahead and introduce your show there, Mike.
All right. Thank you, Glenn. And thank you for being with me, Joe. And thank you all for joining us. As Glenn said, we're talking about the Oregon Forest Protection Laws. And here's an outline of what we're going to cover. We're going to have information on the purpose and the major provisions of the Act, We're going to talk a lot about the illustrated manual because that's one of the reasons we put this class together, is to share the illustrated manual of the Oregon Forest Protection Laws, some of the features of it. Then one of the fun parts is Joe is going to work through a couple of examples, some on regular streams with timber harvest, some on the new SSBT, which you'll learn about. And he's also going to do an online thing on ferns, because it's also a new feature. Then we're going to finish up talking about reforestation and wildlife examples, and then finally talk about where to get more help. So that's where we're going. But before we go there, Glenn is going to lead us through a poll, because we want to learn about you in general. And then we also want to learn the last two questions are specifically about the Forest Practices Act.
All right, so we started the poll, and so you should see it pop up, or if you can, press a button and pop it up yourself. And there's 5 questions on the poll. So starting out, where are you from? And then are you a woodland owner or a forester or other professional or other? How many acres of forest do you own or manage? And then a couple of questions about timber harvesting and if you've used the ferns program. And I'll just keep my eye on this as the answers come in. We usually get it all done pretty quick, within a minute or so. We hit 90% participation in the poll earlier today, so let's see if we can beat that.
Don't let us down, King. We want to beat Steve. Go, poll, go. Besides, this is election day, so I know you've already put your ballots in the mail, I hope. But if you haven't, this is your other chance to vote. Yeah, that got a few extras.
All right, bring it home, Mike. All right, I think we're ready to call it good then. And the poll is over. I'm going to share the results. I'll start off, and then if you want to say something about what you see there, Mike, that's fine. But first, where we're all from. Willamette Valley area is about 2/3, and coastal Oregon about 15%, 8% from Southwest Oregon. Nobody from Eastern Oregon, so we're covering West Side rules then. Washington State, a couple, and some from elsewhere in the U.S., so welcome to Oregon. Down the line, woodland owners, about, again, almost 2/3 of folks are woodland owners, and another 30% are natural resource professionals, and about 15% are not woodland owners or forestry professionals. Acreage owned, well, about a quarter of folks don't own land, but want to learn about forest practices. And then about 10 to 40 acre range is usually where most of the folks are, or the largest segment, and that's 30%. Another 18%, 40 to 100, and then a fair number of folks that own 100 to 1,000 acres. And then there's questions about harvesting timber. So about 43% have harvested timber and 58% haven't. And those who have used ferns, about 35%. So that's a big part of learning about how the Forest Practices Act is administered.
All right.
All right.
Well,
I'll stop sharing
much.
And off we go.
So we're going to talk about the Oregon Forest Practices Act today, mostly. A few other things we'll talk about, some fire stuff and some other stuff that's not part of the OFPA, but mostly the OFPA. And it was enacted in 1971. And one of the things I always like to do at the beginning is sometimes you hear people talk about the Oregon Forest Practices Act, other times about the Oregon Forest Practices Rules. And really there's both. An act is something done by the legislature, and it's always it would have an ORS number, Oregon Revised Statutes. So that's what happens first. But then the acts, and when the legislator does something, then the Board of Forestry is the one that oversees it, and they make the rules. So those are called, I forget what the rules are called. I have one set right here, and I have to look it up. They are called the, doesn't jump out at me, something rules. Anyway, Joe will know that when we get to him. But anyway, the rules are made by the board, the acts is made by the legislature, but the important thing for most landowners is the enforcement is by the Department of Forestry. The other thing that's important to know about the Forest Practices Act is it governs any commercial activity. So commercial activity includes timber harvest, but it also includes road building. It includes any kind of herbicide spraying. It includes anything that would affect fish. because that's a commercial thing. So it doesn't involve, like, if you're cutting Christmas trees or firewood for personal use, but we'll talk about the ferns and the notification. And that does talk about those things, because if you're using any kind of power-driven equipment, you need to file the notification about that. So moving next, why do we have a forest practices rules? And again, I think we're really blessed here in Oregon. Our whole idea of regulating forestry is not just to tell landowners what they're supposed to do, but it's based on the premise that we want to sustain all forest benefits. So that includes the productivity for timber is an important thing that the forest practices rules are trying to sustain. But we also want to sustain the soil, the water, the air, the fish, the wildlife, all of the resources. So it's really about sustainability. We want to ensure that landowners can manage their forests for a variety of objectives. So part of this is there's like the right to forest that's built into our Oregon Forest Practices rules, but the right to forest is only as good as society lets us manage. So again, the forest practices rules and having forest practices rules makes us have the social license to operate, is some fancy sociology words. But what it really says is, because we have forest practices rules, we manage our forests well, and people know that and they accept it. Finally, the forest practices rules set standards for all non-federal forest lands. So really it's talking about private, state, county, city, all of those kind of lands. It doesn't technically set standards for the federal lands, but the federal land management agencies have signed memoranda with the Department of Forestry that says they'll meet or exceed. So it really is all forest lands, but in terms of enforcement, it's just the non-federal. So key provisions, it requires a notification of operations. And again, this is for any commercial activity. When you do a notification, it really does three things. It lets the notification happen to the Department of Forestry that you're doing a commercial activity. It also lets you get a power-driven machinery permit, which lets the fire people know that there may be a fire hazard. And finally, it lets the Department of Revenue know that maybe you might have some money owing to them. So if you always wonder how the tax man knows, it's because you did a notification. That's one of the things that happens. Other key provisions protects all the waters of the state, and it does this in many ways, but one of the most important is it sets requirements for the riparian management areas. In 1970, the US Congress passed the Clean Water Act, and as part of that, the EPA set up rules that said every state needs to have best management practices. In the state of Oregon, the best management practices are part of the forest practices rules. So when we protect the waters of the state, we're not only doing it for the state, but we're doing it for the country. We have provisions to require wildlife trees. We'll talk about those, snags and down logs. And also there are a number of individual species that there are protection guides for in the OFPA. Other key provisions include setting guidelines for harvest operations and slash treatment. And this is a good example in the really nice illustration here, which is an example of an illustration from the illustrated manual. You can see where the tractors are working and they're not working in the stream. And you need to do your harvest operation to protect the stream. You also need to deal with slash, and that's what the excavator and the CAT are both doing, is dealing with slash. And then it also gives guidelines for operating in high landslide areas, another key provision. It kind of says where you may not be able to operate in certain areas, and if you do operate in those areas, what special practices you need to follow. Big provisions in there on road construction. There's a whole chapter in the books on road construction. A lot of that has to do with drainage, especially crossing streams, because again, remember, one of the things we want to do is keep the waters clean. And this diagram, which is one of my favorites in the book, it shows some key ways that the stream is being separated from the road. So first of all, you have this ditch coming down on the right. You get to a cross drain to get the water away from the stream. It goes down onto the forest land. Then you have a very nice pipe through the stream. and you're elevated again to keep water from the road out of the stream. And then an example at the left side is this ford, which is another kind of stream crossing that can be used in some situations. Or a water bar is another thing that could be showing. That again, when the water is moving down from the left, it hits the water bar and then crosses out of it. It's not a ford at all, it's a water bar. Sorry about that. Key provisions also for reforestation and about use of chemicals, and we'll talk about both of those in today's presentation. All of these things are laid down in the rules, and here's an example of what they call the newsprint forest practice rules, and this is chapter 29 of the rules, and this is available, a PDF of it, on the resources page, and Julie has posted in the chat box with a link to the resources page where you can get all the resources that Joe and I have set aside for you. But this is one that you can download. And this is a really, really useful tool, but it's also really boring to read, and it's a little confusing at times. And that is the reason why OFRI developed, gosh, the first one was way back in 2003. We developed the Illustrated Manual of the Forest Protection Rules. And it's been, again, not designed to replace the newsprint rules, which are the law, but to make something that's quick and easy for people to use. And we think it does a really good job. So a lot of the diagrams you'll see in our talk today and a lot of the examples come right out of the book. And I heard this from a stewardship forester once. It wasn't Joe, but somebody told me, if you see the stewardship forester getting out of his pickup, if he has the illustrated manual in his hand, that's a good sign, because he's probably going to talk to you about how to do things better. If he has the newsprint in his hand, he may have the ticket book in the other hand, because that's really where the rules are that they enforce. But for talking to people and educating them, the illustrated manual is unparalleled. And this is the 3rd edition, and I really have to honor Bob Logan, who did the first, and Paul Adams, that authored the 3rd, along with Rex Storm, and I was lucky enough to get to be the author for the 3rd one. It's divided up into 8 tabs. Oh, again, this is available. You can order it from OFRI, although right now we're not shipping publications, but if you go to our website, oregonforest.org, you can order it, but we have one that you can download from the resources page. So it's very easy to download, but believe me, it's the kind of book that you'd want to have for real, because it's a nice book. So tab 1 is about the introduction. Tab 2 talks about planning a timber harvest. A lot of the stuff that Joe's going to cover on the riparian management areas are in there. Tab 3 is about doing a harvest. Talks about the slash and the logging and all of that sort of stuff, where you can operate, where you can't. Tab 4 talks about reforestation. Tab 5, fire and chemicals. Tab 6 is all about roads and streams. We won't be going into that too much. Tab 7 is about other considerations, and tab 8 is a real cool appendix. It has a whole lot of extra material in there. One of the things Joe will talk about is, how do you find your site index? There's information in the appendix to help you find your site index. So the other cool thing we talk about in there is e-notifications on page 6. And this is where I turn it over to Joe, because he's going to talk a little about e-notifications, and he's going to give a demonstration. So I'm going to stop sharing. But before I do, just to make sure, I want to do again is that the notification does 2 things. It does the notification of operations, but also the permit to operate power-driven machinery. So in some cases, like during fire season, if you're doing something that may not need a notification because it's not commercial, if you're using power-driven machinery, you need a notification. So I'm going to stop sharing so Joe can share his, what do you call it? Internet, the web page. So Joe's going to take us to the web page for Ferns, and take it away, Joe. You must be muted.
Can you see the web page?
Yes.
Okay. So FERMS is the Forest Activity Electronic Reporting and Notification System, and it was brought online in 2014. And prior to that, notifications were done on a paper form. You'd have to come into an ODF office and turn in a paper form to get your notification filed. All notifications are now done electronically, so you can do them from any computer with an internet connection. And then you can still come into ODF offices, and there's a computer at the front desk in each office where you can file a notification from there if you don't have access to a computer. And so I'm just going to go through a basic example of how you fill out a notification for a timber harvest. I am using our test site, so when I submit this notification, it will not actually be submitted to the real site. That way we don't make a fake notification. To get to the actual site, you can either go to the Department of Forestry website, and under Working Forests, you would click e-notification, or you can just search under Google Oregon Department of Forestry FERMS, and it will be the first site to pop up. And so the first thing you would need to do if you've never used it before would be to register, and you just click the register button. And once that loads, it's just basic information, name. You do need an email address. You create a password, and then there's basic information, address, phone number. If you're a landowner or timber owner, you will need to fill out some extra information down here. Otherwise, it won't let you add yourself as a landowner or timber owner. And similarly, if you are filing a notification for someone else, you would need their information for landowner type and either employee identification number or last four of the social to add them as a timber owner. Once you submit this, you'll get an email. You'll have to go to the email and click a confirmation link to activate your account. That can sometimes get sent to the spam folder, so if you don't see the email, check there. But I already created one, so I'm just going to sign in, and it will take you to your dashboard. And on your dashboard, the left column over here are notifications you've already submitted. I did one for practice, a thinning notification. In the right column, anytime a forester makes a comment on a notification or does an inspection, it will pop up over here. And you'll also receive an email, so you don't have to come in to check this to see if you've had a new inspection. It will just send you an email, and then you can log in and read the inspection. But to create a new notification, you just click Create No App. First thing you do is you name it. I'm just going to call it Harvest. If you were doing a notification for someone else and you weren't the landowner, timber owner, operator, you could select this button. And then there's three options. Mike already talked about them, but notify state forester for operations described in this notification. Pretty much we'll always be clicking that except for some fire season stuff where it's not in operation. Apply for a permit to use fire or power-driven machinery. Anytime you're within a forest protection district and you're using a internal combustion engine for forest operation or fire, you need to select that. And then finally, notify state forester and Department of Revenue if you're harvesting timber. So if you were just spraying or burning slash, you wouldn't necessarily have to select that. If you're unsure, select all three. The foresters will review and change if necessary. Once you have that completed, you go to Map, and this is where you will draw out your operation area. And so we have a map of Oregon. A couple ways. If you know where you're looking for, you can just zoom in with the mouse wheel or with the zoom button. There's also a search function. You can type in, if you know, legal location, township range, or GPS coordinates. You can also do addresses. So I'm just going to type in an address. And once you type enough information, it'll pop up. You can click on it and it'll zoom you in. And then over on the right, there's a few different layers to switch between. This is pretty basic view, but you can do an aerial view and kind of orient yourself a little better. There's also tap slots and roads you can select. So we're going to say that this is my property and I want to harvest the eastern portion of it. So to do that, we draw our operation area. You'll have several options: harvest, roads, chemical, and other silviculture. And you can just look through those and find what you're looking for. If you don't see your activity, there's kind of some catch-alls. You can do a special or other activity and draw either the polygon line or point, and then just describe in the description for the activity what you're doing. But for us, we're going to be doing a clear cut. So we select clear cut, and it brings up the draw tool, and all you do is just start clicking where you plan on doing your harvest. You don't have to be super accurate, but you want to be fairly accurate with what you're drawing. And then to close out the polygon, you just double click, and it will become a red outline polygon. That means it's completed the polygon. You can give the unit a name, and then you click Add Activity, and that'll let you enter the details for the activity. Basic information: they want to know the quantity of the volume of timber you're going to be removing. We don't expect it to be spot on, but your best estimate. Usually a logger will be able to give you a good estimate. Start and end dates. There is a 15-day waiting period, so you can either set your start date out 15 days, or if you want to start sooner, you can put you'll be starting sooner, but you need to request a waiver. And then for end date, we just recommend going through the entire year. The notifications are good for 1 calendar year. And then whether you'll be cable tower yarding or ground-based yarding or helicopter or other, if you select other, you can type in what exactly that is. And then finally, the operator that's going to be doing the work for you. And so you can either, if you're doing the work yourself, you can select I'm the operator and it'll fill in your information. If you're hiring someone else, you first have to search for them. And so you just type in the name of the company or name of the logger and then click search. It'll bring back anybody with that name in it, and you can just look through the pages and see if you can find the right operator. If you don't see it, then you would proceed to add a new operator, and you would need their name, mailing address, phone number, the basic information. But we're going to use this one, so you just click Add to Activity. If you scroll down, it's entered the operator's information. If you were going to be doing chemical or slash burning as well, you could click Add Another Activity, and that'll bring up a blank activity. You can select treatment of slash if we're going to be burning slash piles. Select the burning slash piles. Set your dates once again. And let's say I'm going to be doing the slash burning myself, not having the logger do it. So I just click I am the operator, and it brings my information in as the operator. And then if there was going to be another unit, or if I needed to do road construction, you could go back to the map and start the process all over again and do road construction or anything else that you might also want to notify for. Once you have all your stuff, all the activities entered, you can click Go to Contacts, and this is where you enter your landowner, timber owner information. If you're filing for someone else, it's the same search process for both, but for this notification, I'm the landowner and I am the timber owner, and it just enters my information there. And then place for a fire emergency contact, and this is generally the landowner. Sometimes people enter the fire department, but really want the landowner information because in case of a fire started from the operation or a wildfire, we want to get in contact with the landowner because there are landowner responsibilities in the event of a wildfire. Once that's in, you can click Go to Conditions. And this page is basically about site conditions, slopes, waters of the state, wildlife and cultural resources. We don't expect you to know every answer perfectly on this. Just answer these to the best of your ability. It's basically questions about is there past or ongoing or potential mass soil movement. We'll say no. If you know the steepness of the slope to the nearest 5%, you can enter that. We'll say this is generally flat, 15% and less. And then, are you aware of any high landslide hazard locations? Those are slopes in western Oregon, generally over 80%. There are special rules depending on if there are residents below these locations or if you're going to be potentially operating cable assist tether machinery on those slopes. And then, will your proposed clear cut, along with any other clear cuts you own, exceed 120 acres? We'll say no. And then we get to the questions about waters. We want to know, are you aware of any water resources within 100 feet, streams, seep springs, or lakes? We'll say yes, we know there's a stream near our operation. And then any of the following water resources within 300 feet, estuaries, wetlands, bogs, domestic water supplies. And the wetlands and lakes are broken to greater than and less than 8 acres because there are different rules for lakes and wetlands under 8 acres and then for lakes and wetlands over 8. And then the final part is cultural resources and wildlife. Just if you're aware of any cultural resources, and then eagles, pigeons, great blue herons, marble murrelet, spotted owl, osprey. We do review for all these resources when we look at the notification, so we don't expect you to know everything. We just want your best, what you're aware of, because we do have most of the resources mapped out, but there have been a few cases where we did not have some resources mapped out, and the landowner didn't know about them, which was very helpful. So once you answer all those, there is a page where you can upload documents. If you have PDF documents you want to upload, like a map, or if you've already done a written plan because you know you need one, you can upload it here. We can always upload documents later too. Once the forester reviews the notification, they can determine if a written plan is required. So don't feel like you have to upload anything here. And then once you're done, you can click Go to Summary, and you can review everything that you entered. And so at the top has the name and the power-driven machinery, notify state forest operations, and Department of Revenue. It lists the ODF office that your operation area falls within, as well as the stewardship forester for that area. And then it lists the notifier. There is a place for you to put comments. This is where if you wanted a waiver of the 15-day waiting period, or say would like to meet forester on site prior to operations. Just if there's something special you want to communicate with the forester, you want to make sure you hit save comment, because if you don't, it will erase your comment when you submit it. You then have the landowner timber owner information, fire emergency contact, and here's where your activities are listed. You can click and go back into these. If you realize the address for the logger is wrong, you can go back in and change the operator. And then down here is just the resources we identified on that conditions tab. So if you review all that and it looks correct, you can go hit the submit button. You can also navigate to each tab up here to make changes. Just want to make sure to hit save before you click between these, or you will lose anything that you changed. Once you're confident everything looks good, you just hit the submit button. There's a message about there is a 15-day waiting period. You have to request a waiver if you want to start before then. You do need to wait until you hear from the forester that the waiting period is waived. And then just a message about pesticides and following label requirements, and that everything is true to the best of your knowledge. Once you hit submit, you'll get your no app has been submitted successfully. If you don't get that message, either something was entered incorrect or something's missing and it didn't get submitted. And so you need to make sure that you get that submitted successfully. Once you're done with that, you can always return to your dashboard just by clicking on the Ferns word up here, and you can see our new notification has shown up under my no apps. And so with that, I think we'll go back to the PowerPoint.
All right, there you go, Joe.
Okay, so if you want to harvest timber on your property, how do I plan for it? So there's several steps that you'll want to do. You'll want to determine the harvest type, and that's based on the site class for reforestation, if there's going to be reforestation required, harvest unit acreage, and then potentially diameters and basal areas of trees you will leave. This is important if you're harvesting near streams or other water features like lakes or wetlands. So in our example, we have a proposed 24-acre clear-cut harvest along a stream. And so we are going to be doing a clear-cut harvest. There's several different types of harvest. Type 1 harvest, the heavy thinning or shelter wood. These harvests require reforestation but do not require wildlife trees. Type 2 harvest, a green clear-cut, is one that requires wildlife trees but no reforestation. There's enough seedlings and saplings afterwards that reforestation isn't required. And then a type 3 harvest is your traditional, when you think of a traditional clear cut, and these require reforestation, wildlife trees, and down wood. And then finally, thinning or selective harvest is basically just your thinning where you're not removing the entire overstory. So for a type 3 harvest clear cut, ours is 24 acres in the example, so 25 acres is kind of a breaking point. Harvests under 25 acres do not require wildlife trees or down wood. If you were to do one over 25 acres, you would need to leave trees and down wood. It still requires reforestation, and you must plant within 2 years following the completion of logging and have free-to-grow seedlings within 6 years following the completion of logging. So other information that you need to know is the geographic region of your harvest. You can do this either by looking in the illustrated manual or the newsprint copy. All this information, too, you could contact your local stewardship forester, and they can look up this information easily. There are different leave requirements for different types of streams in different geographic regions. That's why number 1 is important. 2, the type of stream in your harvest area. There's several different types of streams. Type F has fish use. A lot of times also has domestic use, but fish use has higher protection requirements. Type SSBT, which is a subset of type F streams, and these are smaller medium streams that have salmon, steelhead, or bull trout present. Type D streams are used for domestic use, domestic water, but do not have fish use. And then type N are for all other uses. There's also, the streams are also broken down into size classes, small, medium, and large. The protection requirements for each type of stream, whether it's fish domestic or SSBT, changes depending on whether the stream is small, medium, or large. You need to know the type of harvest, which we just discussed, and then the length of stream affected by harvest. And again, you can contact your local stewardship forester, and they can easily measure the length of the stream on the mapping program instead of having to go out and pull tape if it's quite a long stretch of stream. So for our example, we are going to assume we're in the coast range, the coast georegion. The type of stream is a type F or fish stream. The size class is large. Our harvest type is a type 3 clear cut, and we measured the stream length to be 1,600 feet. And so for a large type F stream, the RMA width is 100 feet. And you can see that this is from the illustrated manual. This is a table showing the different stream sizes along with the different types of streams along the top and their corresponding RMA widths. These are the widths that within these distances a written plan may be required for any operation, not necessarily just harvesting, but if you were to be building a road within these distances or spraying within these distances, you may also need a written plan for those activities. So how is the RMA measured? So RMAs, depending on the size and type of beneficial use, vary from 20 to 100 feet. And they're measured on the slope, along the slope, and from the average high water mark of the stream, as you can see in the picture. And so this is just a demonstration of how you would go about marking that 100 feet. You measure 100 feet from each side, the high water mark on each side. In the middle with that side channel, you would actually start measuring from the edge of the side channel to include that within the entire RMA. So any side channels do need to be included within the RMA. So this is just another picture of it. It's got the yellow line showing our 100-foot RMA for our 24-acre clear cut along a large type F stream. And so what do we need to know to harvest the timber within 100 feet of the stream? Two things, basically: how much live conifer basal area, and that's all trees at least 6 inches diameter breast height, and then how many live conifers at least 11 inches diameter breast height are in the RMA. So if we were to go out, and a couple of the resources that were added to the resource page are tally sheets to actually write down if you were to go out and measure your RMA, and they have conversion tables to where if you take the diameter of the tree, you can just look at the table and it will tell the corresponding basal area for that diameter of tree. But for our example, we're going to say that we have on average 180 trees per 1,000 feet within the RMA, and of those 180 trees, it equates to 460 square feet of basal area per 1,000 feet. So once you have that information, you can choose your RMA management option. Most of the time, the general prescription will be used. There's a couple other prescriptions I'll talk about. But the general prescription for a type F or type D stream is all trees within 20 feet of the high water mark are reserved from cutting. Any trees leaning over the stream channel itself are reserved. You have to protect all understory vegetation within 10 feet of the high water mark. All snags and down wood within the 100-foot RMA need to be retained. Snags can be felled for safety reasons, but they would need to be left within the RMA. And then you need to leave the specific amount of live conifers to meet the standard target and the conifer count. And so here's the different prescriptions for managing a Type F RMA. The general prescription has the standard target and the active management target. The active management target is used mainly for in-stream wood placement projects where you can leave less standing trees within the RMA. You get credit for placing additional woody material, large woody material in the stream. And then the alternate prescriptions are generally only for acts of nature, wind, fire, disease, insects, or if you have an RMA that's dominated by hardwoods, you can do a hardwood conversion. You would want to speak with your local stewardship forester if you were interested in pursuing a alternate prescription. Most of the time, you're just going to be following the standard target under the general prescription. So the standard target is the minimum basal area required for the RMA. It's table 2.4 on page 23 of the illustrated manual. I believe we're going to be looking at that in the next slide. But that standard target is 230 square feet of basal area per 1,000 feet of stream for conifers at least 6 inches diameter breast height. And then you also need 40 live conifer per 1,000 feet of stream at least 11 inches in diameter. And so this table shows the various basal area targets for the different geographic regions on the left, and then the different size classes of Type F streams, and then also lists the standard and active management targets. And again, the active management is less because if you were using the active management, the basal area you would be cutting would be going into the stream for large wood placement. So in our example, we had 180 trees per 1,000 feet and 460 square feet of basal area per 1,000 feet. Using the standard target, we could remove about half the conifer basal area further than 20 feet from the stream. And for the live conifer count, we could remove up to 140 conifers and any hardwoods more than 20 feet from the stream. The trees within 20 feet do count towards the standard target and live conifer count, but you do need to meet both the standard target and live conifer count to harvest trees. And typically, you will meet one and exceed the other. So you'll either have more basal area than is required, but you do that because you needed extra trees for the live conifer count, or the other way around, you meet the basal area but you meet the basal area but had to leave a few extra live conifer because you didn't have enough. And with that, I think it's a question break.
All right, well, we do have a couple of questions. And I encourage you to add more now if you want to get a quick answer during our midpoint break here. Actually, the first one I think has been answered, and that was what exactly is FERNS, which is the acronym for the electronic notification system that Joe just reviewed. So I'll move on from that one. Here's a question. To be clear, if you have a tractor that you use for daily maintenance, not harvesting, do you need to submit this? Do you need to file a notification for power-driven machinery just for maintenance using your tractor?
So that's kind of a tough question. If you were to read the rules, how they're written, a PDM is required for any activity within a fire protection district conducted on forest land. And the forest land is defined as any ground that can support and grow vegetation that could carry a wildfire. So technically, yes, but that being said, we do not get notifications from farmers or PDMs from farmers mowing their fields, from people mowing their grass, that kind of stuff. It's generally more geared towards forest operations. There are public and industrial fire restrictions during fire season, and so most of the time a lot of like mowing of grass and that kind of stuff falls under the public fire restrictions.
And the PDM, the power driven machinery notification, is that only during fire season?
Technically no, but so the local district foresters for every district have the option to waive the PDM requirement outside of fire season. But inside of fire season, yes, you do need it. I would recommend if you are going to be filing a notification, just to include the PDM, and because it's just basically you're clicking one extra button. You do fall under the industrial fire restrictions at that point, but it's something. It's something if you're doing a forest operation, you definitely want to have it because it does relieve some liability from you as a landowner for responsibility if a fire is started on your property.
Okay, thank you. Here's another one. Do you need to submit an application for firewood harvest for personal use?
You do not need to file a notification for personal use harvest. If you are going to be doing commercial firewood, that is selling the wood commercially to other people, then yes, you would technically need to file a notification for that. Kind of similarly, special forest products like boughs do not require a notification, but selling of the wood fiber generally is what would require a notification.
But if you're using a chainsaw to cut your firewood, do you need the PDM notification?
If you were selling it commercially, if you're doing it for personal use, you would not need a PDM. You would fall under the public fire restrictions, which basically, depending on the fire danger level, you either can only run that saw until 10 in the morning or 1 in the morning. You need a gallon of water or a fire extinguisher nearby and a shovel.
Yeah, so the key is being extremely mindful of fire conditions when you're thinking of starting an engine
Right.
in the woods.
Yep. And if you have any questions, call your local office, talk to either protection staff or a stewardship forester and explain what you're looking at doing, and they can put you in the right direction.
Very good. What happens when these rules are not followed? How are they monitored and enforced?
So the industrial operations are monitored by the stewardship foresters. We do field inspections of all notified operations, and we do fire inspections on the industrial fire equipment, their water supplies, tools, extinguishers. While we're out doing that, we're driving around a lot, so if the notification hasn't been filed, chances are we're either going to hear a saw running or see a new clear cut that wasn't notified for, and so we do run into that from time to time. But then also during fire season, the seasonal fire crews, part of their job is to patrol daily, and they're staffing 7 days a week, and so they're out maybe half the day just driving around, not only looking for smokes, but looking for prevention opportunities if they see anybody not following the rules.
Another question, how do Oregon's scenic waterways fit into the stream guidelines? Do they have any extra protections?
So scenic waterways are one of the resources we review for. We don't Department of Forestry does not directly regulate that, but you are required to fill out a couple forms with Oregon Parks and Rec Department, which do regulate the scenic waterways. Generally, we're not too involved in their requirements, but generally people have been able to harvest under our rules after going through the application process with them.
Very good. And I guess another version of that is things like the Columbia Gorge National Scenic Corridor. And that's
I'm not an expert on that, but that's a whole nother can of worms.
Yeah, that's a different kind of scenic waterway.
It's difficult if you weren't under one of the special exceptions when that was implemented. It's very difficult to harvest in that area.
Yep, and there's another group that deals with that through the Columbia Gorge Commission and the Forest Service. Okay, why is there not a definition for a large type SSBT stream, salmon, steelhead, bull trout stream?
So the short answer is there was a research project done that looked at small and medium streams and changes in stream temperatures post-harvest following the forest practice rules on those streams. And so when basing rulemaking off scientific data, you have to stick to the research was done on these streams, and so you can't necessarily extrapolate to a larger type stream. There's also just differences in, like the Columbia or Willamette is a large type F stream. Those behave very differently from sunlight hitting them than a stream that's maybe only 5 to 10 feet in width. And so the entire premise of the research and the rules was increased stream temperature in these small and medium streams. And so additional shade was needed on the small and medium streams to maintain the stream temperature target that's set out by the EPA.
Good. Here's a good one, Joe. Is there someone that can assist with ensuring the proper riparian management areas and that they're appropriate, they meet the basal area requirements?
So yes, there are. Some loggers have experience laying out the RMAs. There are also consultants that will manage your entire project and lay out RMAs. Obviously, they work for an additional fee. And then depending on stewardship forester workload, you may be able to get a stewardship forester to come out and help you lay out a section of the stream to get you started. Or if you wanted to try and lay it out yourself and then have them come out and look, they may be able to do that as well.
Okay, and I should say OSU Extension, we've periodically teamed up and offered workshops in understanding the riparian protection rules and how to look at that. And so stay tuned for those in the future. One more question. Is information on harvesting made available to the public?
So yes, the notifications are public information. You can, if you were to create an account like I showed to file a notification, I didn't talk about it, but one of the other buttons at the top was subscribe, and it's basically the same as filing a notification. You can outline an area in Oregon where you want to follow, and then select whether, if you just want to know about road building or harvesting or herbicide application or all three. You can select the activities you're interested in, the area you're interested in. You could do an area around your house or a county-wide or statewide You draw that area, and then it works exactly the same. When a notification is filed, you get an email saying a new harvest notification was filed in your area, and then you can click on the link and log into your account and look at that notification.
Okay, well, very good. That's the end of this batch of questions. So we'll return to the presentation and we'll have more questions.
Before I kick Joe loose again, I just had one comment I wanted to make.
Very
and
good.
That is on the ferns, you fill out who's the timber owner and who's the landowner. And people often want to say, why is that? And the simple way I think about it is the landowner is the one that's responsible for reforestation and anything that happened on the site that may not be right. That's the landowner's responsibility. The big responsibility for the timber owner is they're the ones that need to pay the taxes. So that's why they're two separate people. Would you agree with that, Joe?
Yeah, that's correct. Yes, the landowner is responsible for, most of the time the landowner is a timber owner. There are cases where that doesn't happen, but yeah, what Mike said is correct.
All right. Now on to example 2. We'll deal with some SSBT stuff. Take it away, Joe.
Okay, so for our second example, we're going to stay in the coast georegion, but this time we're going to be doing a harvest along a medium type SSBT stream. We're still going to be doing a type 3 clear cut with same length of stream, except this time the RMA width is 80 feet for a medium SSBT. And so this is just pretty much the same map, except this time that yellow line would be at 80 feet from the stream high water mark. And so the SSBT RMA is different than a normal type F RMA. It still has the 0 to 20 foot no harvest zone, but then it's broken down into 2 other zones. For a medium, that's the inner zone from 20 feet to 50 feet, and then the outer zone from 50 feet to 80 feet. On a small, the total width is 60 feet, and so your inner zone would be 20 feet to 40 feet, and your outer zone would be 40 feet to 60. And there are basal area and live tree retention requirements in both the inner and outer zones for SSBT streams. And so if you want to harvest within the RMA of a SSBT stream, what do you need to know? It's the same information, just a little different. How much basal area is in both the inner and outer zones of the RMA. And on SSBT streams, you get to count both hardwood and conifer for the basal area, at least 6 inches in diameter. And then how many live conifers are in the inner and outer zones, and those need to be at least 8 inches in diameter. And so if we were to go out and measure in our example, in the inner 20 to 50 foot zone, we measured 35 conifer per 500 feet and 85 square feet of basal area per 500 feet, and that's conifer and hardwood. Important thing to mention, it's at the bottom of the slide, but for type SSBT streams, the segment length is 500 feet, while on the previous type S example, the segment length was 1,000 feet. So that is an important difference to note. But back to the example, outer zone 50 to 80 feet, we measure 20 conifer per 500 feet and a basal area of 70 square feet per 500. And this is all stuff outside the high water mark, 20 foot high. And so the general prescription for SSBT is still the same as for type F. All trees within 20 feet of the high water mark are reserved. Any trees leaning over the stream channel, all understory vegetation within 10 feet needs to be protected, and then all snags and down wood within the entire RMA. And then finally the live conifer and hardwood basal area and live conifer count. So the prescriptions for SSBT are a little different than for a regular type F stream. Your first option is no harvest, and that's where you would just leave everything within 60 feet of a small or 80 feet of a medium SSBT. The second option is partial harvest, which is the example we're going through, and that's where you manage to the basal area and live conifer targets for the inner and outer zones. Third option is north-sided buffer, and this is for streams that run primarily east to west and are at least 200-foot segments, and that's where you can, on the north side of those streams, just leave a 40-foot no harvest buffer. And then the last two are relief prescriptions, which were designed for landowners that own smaller acreage but have a significant segment of SSBT stream on their property, and that allows you to use smaller RMA widths and smaller basal area and conifer count targets. 3, 4, and 5, you have to contact your stewardship forester for those because we do need to do some calculations or measurements to see if you qualify. So this table we're looking at is the basal area and conifer count targets for SSBT streams. At the top there, kind of the second line, it's for the georegions of the Coast Range, South Coast, Interior, and Western Cascades. It doesn't include Eastern Oregon or Siskiyou. That's kind of what I talked about before. None of the research was conducted in those outside of the 4 areas listed, and so these rules only apply to the 4 georegions listed. They are currently doing research into the other areas, so there may be changes there. But if you look on the left are your basal area target amounts, and if you look at medium type SSBT for the inner zone, there's a minimum of 18 square feet per 500 feet of stream, and the same for the outer zone, a minimum 18 square feet of basal area per 500 feet. But you need a total of 69 square feet between those two zones. So each zone requires a minimum, but there is an additional 33 square feet of basal area that has to be put into one of those zones. You could put it in the inner zone or outer zone or split it between the two, but you do need a total of 69 square feet. Then on the right-hand side is the live conifer count, and kind of same with the basal area. It's a minimum of 7 trees in both the inner and outer zone, but you do need a minimum of 15 trees total, so you would be allocating at least one additional live conifer within either the inner or outer zone. So in our example, inner zone, we had 35 live conifers and 85 square feet of basal area per 500 feet. Outer zone, 20 live conifers, 70 square feet of basal area. To meet the prescription of 18 square feet in the inner and outer zones and 69 feet total, and the 7 live conifer in the inner and outer zones, and a minimum of 15 total. That basically translates, we can potentially harvest 28 conifer in the inner zone and 67 square feet, and potentially harvest 13 conifer and 52 square feet in the outer zone, but we have to take into account that we do need an additional 1 conifer and 33 square feet of basal area. So we won't be harvesting everything that can potentially be harvested. It'll be up to us where we locate the additional conifer and basal area within those 2 zones. And the same with the type F stream, both the basal area targets and live conifer counts have to be met in both zones. And then finally, harvesting around other waters, there are different requirements for large, medium, and small type D or N streams, different requirements for lakes depending on size and whether there are fish in the lakes, and then different requirements for wetlands of different sizes. And that all can be found in both the newsprint and the illustrated guide, and you can also get in touch with your local stewardship forester, and they'll be able to answer any of those questions for you.
All right. Well, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and take over, and I'm going to talk about wildlife. So as Joe said earlier when he was talking about the harvest type, if the harvest is less than 25 acres, you don't need to leave wildlife trees, but if it's more than 25, you do. And the simple way we remember this is 2 up and 2 down. So you need to have 2 wildlife trees. They can either be snags, which are dead trees, or green trees. And each of them have to be 30 feet tall or taller and 11 inches in diameter or more. And at least half of them have to be conifers. And then for the down logs, they have to be at least 6 feet long and 10 cubic feet. And at least half of them have to be conifers. In addition, if they're 20 cubic feet, they can count as 2 down logs. So you could have 2 down logs that were 10 feet, but if you have a 20 cubic feet log, that could count for 2. And we'll have a table that explains that. This example is what often happens with small woodland owners especially, is your first harvest, which is the one on the left, was 15 acres. And so you didn't have to leave any snags, you didn't have to leave any live trees, you didn't have to leave any down wood. And you can see they took it all, but then they got it reforested. And now guess what? Down the line, they want to do another harvest, and it's right adjacent to it. So what you're required to do in this situation is to leave enough of your snags, your green trees, and your down logs to count for the whole area, if this equals 25 acres or more. So in this situation, the first harvest might have been 15 acres. The next harvest is going to be 15. So because it's greater than 25, you have to compensate and leave it all there. The other thing about these snags and green trees is if you place them near the edge, and you harvest the next unit, you still have to leave them. So the idea is they're not going to last forever, but they're going to last well into the new stand. In terms of the down logs, there's a table in the book, and this we revised in this latest issue, and it shows how long and what diameter you need to have on the small end to have 10 cubic feet. And I got to give a shout out here to Doug McGuire at OSU, because he helped me come up with this table, because most tables, you have to have both end of the log or both diameters of both ends and the length. But with this table that Doug was able to develop for me, you only need the small end diameter and the length. So you can see if you have an 18-inch diameter log, it only has to be 6 feet long. But if you have an 8-inch diameter log at the small end, it needs to be 28 feet long in order to get 10 cubic feet. And then on the right side of the table, this shows how big you have to be 20 cubic feet. Because again, if you have one 20 cubic foot log, that counts for 2 10-foots. So you could have this 6 foot long piece, if it was 18 inches in diameter, that was only 10 cubic feet, but by going to 25 inches diameter, it's 20 cubic feet. So you don't have to leave as many if they're bigger. And this is based again on the science of what the critters that use these need. Additionally, for wildlife, there are recommendations, as Joe mentioned, for several species, northern spotted owl, bald eagle, osprey, blue heron. These are all spelled out very clearly in the illustrated manual. But in addition, the golden eagle, the marbled murrelet, the band-tailed pigeon, there are also requirements. And to help make all of this available, OFRI, led by Julie Woodward and Frank Cafferer-Decaux, has developed fact sheets for each of these species. And it tells you, when the nesting time is, when the young are reared, when you have to not operate and when you can operate. Because if you could conceivably think that if you had 4 or 5 different species, that would really constrain you. So Julie and Fran put together this really nice resource that helps helps you see it. And that's available on the OFRI website under Wildlife and Managed Forests. Finally, under wildlife, there's a big change in this issue under the bald eagle. And this, I think, is one of the successes of the Endangered Species Act, is the bald eagle had been listed as an endangered species at the state level and as a threatened species at the national level. And this was due to the old days when they used DDT and it softened the eggshells and they weren't able to survive. So there were very strict rules in the Oregon Forest Practices rules on what you could do or couldn't do if there was a bald eagle nesting. With the eagle being removed from the threatened and endangered species list, they changed. And so, but they didn't go away because there's still a federal Eagle Protection Act. The big change on the ground is you still need to protect nest trees and you still need to protect the areas around the nest trees, but you used to also have to protect replacement nest trees and also roosting trees had to be protected. So under the new rules, it's a lot easier, but it's still pretty complicated. And this is well spelled out in the new illustrated manual, pages 44 to 45. Final thing before I switch it back to Joe, hopefully he's had a drink of water during the interim. One of the new things we included in the manual this time is a couple of these information sheets on choosing the right contractor. And at the tab that begins the timber page, the timber harvesting, we've taken all of the information from the OSU choosing the right logging contractor and put it on the tab there. So it's exactly the same information. It just looks a little different. And one of the reasons is often the illustrated manual is one of the first books that a lot of landowners get when they're thinking about timber harvest. So we wanted to make sure they not only understood the forest practice rules, but they also helped them learn on how to get a contractor, because it's really important how you make these decisions. And now we're going to switch back to Joe, and he's going to talk about reforestation.
Okay, so do I need to reforest? So obviously, if you're doing a clear cut, reforestation would be required, but there are some cases where if you were to thin below and leave less than a certain amount of standing basal area, then there may also be a reforestation requirement, even if trees are left. And I'll get into those numbers in a little bit. But every acre has to be replanted within 2 years following harvest. Following harvest. Generally in Western Oregon, the minimum requirement is planting 200 trees per acre. We recommend planting between 300 to 400 because 6 years following the completion of the operation, you still need 200 trees per acre free to grow and well distributed. And so free to grow basically means the trees are healthy and likely to survive into the future. And well distributed means they are across the entire operation area. You can't do a 10-acre clear cut and have double stocking on 5 acres, and that won't satisfy the reforestation rules. It needs to be across the entire operation area. And an important thing to note is it is the responsibility of the landowner to accomplish the reforestation, even if you were to have a contract with someone to do the reforestation. If the reforestation was not completed, the landowner is the one on the hook for that. So where is reforestation not required? Reforestation is not required where adequate free-to-grow stocking remains after completion, which would be the conifer reproduction section right there in the middle. It looks like there's good stocking and the trees aren't overtopped by anything. Reforestation is not required on areas not disturbed by the operation. So if you have a patch of hardwoods or junk trees that you don't want to deal with and you don't go in there, then reforestation wouldn't be required in that area. and then on sites that are lower than site class 6. And generally for Western Oregon, if it had good stocking of trees on it, you are going to be at the top, the 200 trees per acre requirement, and basically areas like shallow soils up in the picture, or rock slide areas where trees weren't growing to begin with, are areas where reforestation would not be required. And so this table shows the different requirements for reforestation on the different site classes. So for high site classes, mainly Western Oregon, seedlings, minimum 200 trees per acre. Sapling and poles, which are 1 to 10 inches in diameter, 120 trees per acre. And trees 11 inches and larger, 80 square feet of basal area per acre. So if you were to do a thinning and thinned below 80 square feet of basal area, there would be a reforestation requirement to get back up to that minimum standard. If you were to harvest, say, down to 60 square feet of basal area, there is a formula that you can do a conversion, but if you were to harvest down to 60 square feet, you would have to plant 50 seedlings to make up for that. 50 seedlings convert to 20 square feet of basal area. And so you can, if you have a bunch of seedlings and saplings and poles and a few larger trees left over, you can figure out what the minimum requirement is by taking some measurements. And so to know the site class is based off of site index, which is a measure of soil productivity. Generally, like I said, Western Oregon is going to be high, but site index is based on the average height of dominant and codominant trees compared to their age. And so the examples we have here, Douglas fir, 100-year basis, or 100 years old. If the average height of the trees are 124 feet or more, that'd be a high site class. 80 to 123, medium, and if it was less than that, 80 feet, contact ODS. And then there's an example for 50 years, Douglas fir, and 100-year ponderosa pine. Different species have different indexes, so it's important to have the right one depending on the species of trees you are measuring. And so there's two ways you can figure this out. You can just go to the Soil Conservation Service website, and they have pretty much all of it mapped out. You can just click on your area and it'll tell you your site class. You can also measure and core trees, and basically you are looking for the age of the tree and the average height of the dominant or codominant trees. And then there are tables for the different species that tables and graphs, to where if you have 40-year-old trees and you measure their height, you can look on the graph and look at the regression line to see where you fall along that graph. And so finally, free to grow. Free to grow, I kind of talked about it, but it means the trees on site are healthy and of good vigor and form and are likely to continue growing, and they are not overtopped by other vegetation. So picture on the left, that guy is actually holding a Douglas fir seedling, and there's a line showing how tall it is. It's really hard to see. The crown is so sparse, it's not healthy. A lot of vegetation shading it out. And then compare that to the right. There is other vegetation that some of it's taller than the Douglas fir, but they have full healthy crowns. They're not being overtopped, and they're likely going to continue growing into a forest.
All right. Technology is faster than I am. Thanks, Joe. So I'm going to finish off before we go to Q&A. And the first thing I want to talk about is the section on fire and chemicals. There's a couple of points we want to make in there. But again, one of these OSU fact sheets we've included on how to choose the right chemical applicator. There's also one on choosing the right reforestation operator, but unfortunately, it wasn't ready when we went to press with this. So when we redo this next time, we'll add that. But again, this is really good information on what kind of questions to ask. Neither OFRI or OSU or ODF recommends contractors, but we try to set you up so you can ask the right questions and get the best contractor for your job. So one of the changes in here, and it's now 3 years since we've been under this, is the terminologies used for fire season has changed. The idea of these industrial fire precaution levels. Level 1, which is when fire season begins, used to be called closed season. And it was fire season, but we called it closed season, so it didn't make much sense. Then level 2, which we go to next, now we call limited shutdown. Before they called it partial hoot owl. And, you know, to me, losing the term partial hoot owl is really a loss, but it's a lot less understandable than limited shutdown. And then level 3 is restricted shutdown, which was also called partial shutdown. And before that, it was called hoot owl. So again, with all of these things, they make more sense, but we're losing some of the history. And then level 4, complete shutdown. Nobody can go to the woods other than people to fight fires. These are some of the requirements, and in the book, there's a nice table that lists them all for different levels. As the level gets higher, you have to have more. Once you get into any of the levels, you have to have a permit for power-driven machinery. When you get to level 3, you need to have the fire watch. For all of them, you have different levels of water, firefighting tools, fire extinguishers, chainsaws, all of these. So again, these have changed somewhat to be a little simpler, but also so people know if they're in the right or in the wrong, because they could be a little confusing. So this was a big effort a couple years ago, and we were able to document it in the book. The other thing that's new in the chemical part of the book is this table on spray buffers that you need to leave. And previously, the spray buffers, as Joe was talking about, had to do with just streams. So if it was, any kind of aquatic area, you had to have a 60-foot buffer for aerial spraying and a 10-foot for ground spraying. Well, in 2017, the legislature passed a law to make there be some spray buffers for inhabited dwellings and schools. And that's the third line in the green down there, where it's a 60-foot buffer that needs to be around inhabited dwellings or schools. And for the dwelling, it's from the dwelling itself. For a school, the buffer has to be from the schoolyard. So from the boundary where the school is, that's where the 60-foot buffer. And under the recent memorandum of understanding between the conservation groups and the timber industry, it was agreed that this buffer around dwellings and schools would be increased to 300 feet, but that hasn't happened yet because the legislature didn't get the job done before they left. But in this next legislature, very likely that will go in and this will become 300 foot. But for now, it's 60 foot. And all the rest is pretty much continuing the same. The last thing we want to talk about is what if you need more help? And this has already come up a little because this is pretty complicated stuff. And, loggers may do this every day. Foresters for timber companies may do this every day. But forest landowners, small woodland owners don't. I mean, typically a person will harvest timber 2 or 3 times in their life. And if you want to do it right, you want to follow the rules, you need advice. So first of all, get some advice. There's advice that you can get from consultants or from stewardship foresters, or to take classes from the Extension Service. You can get good data for planning, you can get maps, you can get a lot of help out there. So help is available. Other things that are very helpful that you can get easily are a copy of the Forest Practices Rules, which is available on the resources page for this webinar. ODF on their website has Forest Practices technical notes, which are very, very helpful for things like the wildlife species and for riparian management areas. The illustrated manual is, we think, very, very helpful. But by far, the best resource that you can get if you have any questions, the place to start is the Stewardship Forester, because they can answer the question and give you advice on where to get more information or more assistance. So they're definitely out there to help you. Very finally, the reason we have forest protection laws in Oregon are threefold. We want to protect the public resources. Even timber, although you may own it, but the fact that on that land you're growing timber, that's a public resource. The water, the wildlife, those are public resources that we want to protect. We also, for the landowners and the forestry community, we want to protect the practice of forestry. We want to keep the social license, and we want to make sure that we're able to do what we need to do. And then finally, it's important for you to know about, and so you can comply with on your land, or if you're an operator, to comply with where you're working. So I'd like to open it up for questions at this point.
All right, thank you, Mike and Joe. And I'll leave it up to you, Mike, when you want to put up the slide that reminds folks of the next webinars. We're right at 4:30. We are going to be open for questions in what we call overtime. So we don't want you to leave just yet because there's several questions that we need to answer.
Maybe you want to do the poll before.
Yeah, I think we're going to ask questions, but at the same time, we have a final poll just before you leave. You can fill this out quickly, and I'm going to get our what we call the wrap-up poll. Just tell us what you think about the webinars and give us some input while we go into the Q&A. So here we go with that poll. So just go ahead and do that, and then I'll go ahead and go to the first question here. Do the remaining trees left in the RMA count towards the 2 wildlife trees per acre? RMA trees counting as wildlife trees. That sounds like a Joe question.
That's a great question.
So it depends. Depending on the type and size of stream, for example, a small type F fish stream, any tree within the RMA that meets the wildlife tree requirement, 11 inches and 30 feet in height, counts towards your leaf trees. On a large type F stream, trees above the active management target basal area would count towards. So there's a little extra math you would have to do for a large type F stream, but some of those trees within the RMA do count towards wildlife trees. And so it kind of does vary based on the resource being protected.
Okay, very good. Another question. What percentage of the notifications are going to people who live near or around the affected forest land versus external groups with no connection to forest land? I guess that's how many folks are getting the information about notifications that maybe don't have anything to do with you know, the actual forest land in the area.
So I guess I haven't really looked super close at the numbers, but just I think from what I've seen in my area that I cover, I would say the largest percentage is probably people within the forestry community. So for example, lumber mills, operators, people like that probably have the highest amount of subscriptions. And then I would guess second would be conservation groups and people who are focused on the environmental protections would be second, and then third would be landowners and local neighbors, or however you would want to frame that, I guess, local community.
Okay, yeah, because you can't actually see who all is signed up for ferns. Okay, here's another question. Is there a time frame needed between harvesting an area less than 25 acres and then doing another less than 25 acres adjacent to the first plot harvested?
Yes, there is. So let's say if you harvest 10 acres, that 10 acres would require wildlife trees until the size of those trees that you reforested grow back to the wildlife tree size. So depending on the site, 25, 30 years to get that 11-inch diameter. You're going to hit the 30 feet well before you hit the 11 inches in diameter. But it's once those trees that were cut, the reforestation once again meets the definition of a wildlife tree.
Okay. Another question, is there more time allowed for reforestation due to COVID-19? If someone needs to use the money for unexpected expenses and hard times that are imposed by our current crisis, is there a break for folks due to this pandemic?
So we do issue, we can issue extensions on reforestation. They're generally 1 year in length. Typically, in the past, those have been for situations like if there was a massive nursery failure or something like that, and they just couldn't get seedlings. But in a situation like this, most of the stewardship foresters administering these rules, if you're serious about wanting to get the ground reforested, they're going to be willing to work with you to avoid enforcement action and just to get the area reforested.
Now, isn't that true in general when you see a landowner is making good effort, but they've run into trouble, from various unforeseen circumstances, that you work with them and try to help them succeed?
Sure, yeah. Because in situations like, let's say they did reforest and then we have a major drought summer and they lose 3/4 of their seedlings, they're still required to replant again. But having seen that effort, and they're still on that 2-year time frame, we're willing to work with them as long as they're willing to make the effort to get the reforestation completed.
Here's another question. If someone is going to log next to your property, are they required to tell you?
They are not required to tell you. It is, I would consider that part of being a good neighbor would be to inform your neighbors, but they are legally not required to inform you if they're going to be harvesting their property. That's kind of where the subscription thing was prior to Ferns. If there were still, you could still come get a subscription, but you had to come into the office and fill out paperwork, and there was a yearly fee you had to pay to cover the printing and mailing of paper notifications to you. Where now it's free since you can just sign up online and everything is done electronically.
Another question that showed up in chat, and I'll go ahead and address it. Is there a law on how close a tree can be planted next to property boundaries?
No, there is not. Most of the time that question has been, what about a tree on a property line for cutting? And any tree that splits a property line is owned by both landowners. But planting a tree, there's no law about how close you can plant on your property. So if you wanted to plant right on the edge of your property line, you legally could do that. Kind of the same with harvesting. You're legally not required to harvest any trees that might be on the edge of your property but at risk of falling onto a neighbor's residence. But we do recommend when people harvest that they don't leave any trees that may reach another person's home or barn or something like that to avoid potential civil liability.
Yeah, I think there's a general kind of a practical matter that it's probably a good idea not to plant right on the property line. If the tree gets big enough and touches the line, then your neighbor owns part of it. And then, or again, it might be something to worry about. So if you back off from the property line, it's a little maybe easier to manage and reduce, conflicts or liabilities.
Right.
Another question, what's the difference between arborists and foresters?
Oh, can I take this one, please?
Go ahead, Mike.
All right. So arborists are really the people that take care of city trees, and they're trained a little differently because obviously to manage a tree on a city lot or in a park, it's a different skill than managing in a forestry. And both of them are educated and both of them can be certified. Generally, the International Society of Arboriculture has a very good certification program, including continuing education for arborists, and the Society of American Foresters has a certification program for foresters. The interesting thing is that for most arborists, no one would think about going to a non-certified arborist, and they may not even be able to get insurance for that. But in forestry, it's less common, but we're seeing a move towards more certification. But that's really the big difference. Are you doing an individual tree, or are you managing the woods? And there are some people that are both, but it's really a different set of skills.
I think it's great when we have arborists who are also trained as foresters. But in general, a lot of foresters are not qualified to look at trees in terms of pruning and hazard tree assessment and some of the one tree at a time high value tree evaluations that an arborist would address. But it's nice to have cross training. Well, that's it for all the formal questions in the Q&A. So unless another one pops in the next minute, I think we're ready to close it out.
All right.
So
well,
thanks everybody.
Y'all can see why Joe is such a good guy to have on your team. And I just wish he had a camera so you could also see how good looking he is. But thank you, Joe. Thank you, Glenn. This has really been fun.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Joe.
Thank
Thanks
you,
everyone
Mike.
for coming. Tune in next week. Goodbye, everyone.